Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke to Daisy Johnson, who this year was the youngest author ever to be shortlisted for the Booker Prize.
Daisy spoke about how she got into writing, the experiences she had studying creative writing at Oxford as a master's. She also talked about the Man Booker Prize ceremony and what it was like to attend it, as well as her new book, a horror book, which is yet to be named.
It's a really interesting interview. It gives an insight in what it's like to be at the centre of a kind of literary maelstrom, and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Always Take Notes. We are here with Daisy Johnson, who is the youngest ever author to have been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Congratulations, Daisy. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were when you found out that you were on the long list, how you felt, how you reacted?
Actually, I was the same place when I found out about both the long list and the short list. I was there's a little girl I babysit for, and I was looking after her when my editor rang me, and my editor said, can you go somewhere quiet? And I thought she was going to tell me something awful. I thought something really bad had happened, like they hated my writing, and they and then they told me. And the little girl I was babysitting is very into phones, so she was kind of stood next to me being like, "Phone, Daisy, phone." I felt very overwhelmed, I think. It wasn't even something, obviously it's kind of the dream of every literary writer in the writing in the English language, but it's not something I'd ever considered. It kind of blew me away, to be honest, and it's taken quite a long time to get over it.
And I should have mentioned this is for your book, Everything Under, which is your second book after your collection of short stories, Fen. Can you describe, just briefly for maybe listeners who haven't read it, what it's about?
So it's a retelling of a Greek myth. I won't say what Greek myth, but it's primarily about a young woman who goes on a quest to find her mother. She hasn't seen her mother for over a decade, and as she looks for her, she remembers what it was like to live with her mother. They lived together on a canal boat on the river. She had a very strange childhood, and there's something weird happening when she was a child that she can't quite remember. And eventually she finds her mother, and everything begins coming to a head.
And can we rewind from that to where your kind of interest in writing really began? And I'm really fascinated reading about the Fens and the role of that kind of area. I mean, I grew up in Cambridge, so I'm familiar with that. But could you take us back to the beginning, really, to when you were first interested in putting words on pages?
I think I was always interested in it. I think I was very lucky. I had parents who were always giving me books. I was always reading. I think I was always interested in, slightly in awe of people who were writing, of the writers I was reading. And I definitely think, as you said, that growing up, I grew up in the rural Fens. We moved around a lot.
Where were you?
We moved around a lot, but Newmarket area to begin with, and then kind of moved up into Essex.
Okay.
And we would always live in these very strange rented houses, sort of old churches or old like keepers' houses at the edge of parks. So I had
Why?
I think because, for various reasons, because we were renting, so we'd get thrown out of somewhere because someone else needed to move in, or my dad's job, we moved around a lot for that, or I changed schools. And I remember it really fondly. I loved being in different houses, and I think actually it was probably quite stressful for my parents. But we were always living in places where before you could drive, there was no way to get anywhere. There weren't any buses. And I think maybe that's why I write about what I write, the wild places, and particularly what it means to grow up somewhere like that, how it changes you.
Are you conscious at all of being in a kind of Fenland literary tradition? I mean, do you know that Jill Dawson, who wrote 10 years ago a novel about Rupert Brooke, was kind of very found in that kind of Cambridge or sort of Fenland tradition? Do you see yourself fitting in that at all?
I don't think so, because I think I might go back to it, but certainly for the moment I feel like I've done writing about the Fens. I think I'll always write about nature and the wild areas of the UK, but writing about the Fens was almost something I felt I needed to get out. And I read Waterland, the Graham Swift novel, which I actually didn't like very much. Hopefully he's not going to listen to this. But it was almost a compulsion to write about that place that I'd come from, and I feel like that compulsion is now done, at least for the moment.
When you write about nature, how kind of rooted is it in your own imagination, and how much are you kind of writing down specific notes on what you're seeing around you and going to specific locations, particular to parts of your book?
It always starts with a specific location. So for Everything Under, it was the canal around where I live in Oxford, and riding around that canal with my partner. But then I think it's also my own world, I think, that I'm creating. Potentially readers going along that canal wouldn't recognise it from the book. I think of it as the world, the outside world, but sort of from an angle. But it's always based on somewhere that I've been. The most recent thing I'm working on is set in Yorkshire.
Could you tell us a bit about the role of formal education in creative writing that's played for you? Because am I right in saying you did a creative writing degree both as an undergraduate and then as a master's? We've obviously had people involved from that world on the show, and also Kieran Millwood-Hargreave. Could you tell us what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, I suppose I was very lucky because I knew from quite a young age that I wanted to do something creative. I wanted to be an artist, or I wanted to write. And I was very lucky to know that straight to, going off into education. So I went to Lancaster and did English and creative writing, and then, did creative writing at Oxford. I get really angry, I think, at people who are negative about creative writing courses, because actually I think writing is something that you can learn, and it's about how often you do it. I think you have to learn how to edit, how to be edited, and spending those sort of 5 years before I actually became a writer doing that has made me the writer I am today. And I certainly think that there's sometimes a bit of mystery surrounded by writing, and I just do think it is, surrounding yourself by writers, surrounding yourself by people who are talking about writing, by people who are talking about books is really, really important.
Yeah, why do you think there is still that stigma around creative writing courses? Is it because people like to think like you're born with a natural flair for writing and you either have it or you don't?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's that sort of old image of a writer in a garret on their own, being very lonely, but having these amazing creative ideas that no one else will be able to have. And I think that is an outdated idea. And actually, one of the things that I found most important, particularly from doing the Masters, was meeting other writers who I then have kept in contact with since then, and we read each other's work, we write together, and I think it can be very lonely, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
And how did the experience of the undergrad creative writing course versus the postgrad, what was different with that? We should also say there's various mysterious noises going on outside. Let's just acknowledge that and push on. But yeah, so the difference between the undergraduate experience and the Oxford course.
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose when I was doing it as an undergraduate, I was almost trying it out. I was also doing English literature, but so there was the possibility that I wouldn't be a writer, that's not the direction I would go down. Whereas when I did it as a master's, I suppose I felt like I was putting something on the line. I was saying, right, I'm going to be a writer now. I'm going to really, really try this. Also, the interesting thing about the Oxford Masters is that you try all the different types of writing. So you write plays and you write poetry, which was really interesting. So there were a lot of people on there who didn't know what kind of writing they wanted to do. They just had a feeling that they wanted to write. Also, the Oxford one was part-time, which was quite nice. So I was working at the same time as doing it.
What were you doing?
I was working in a bookshop, in Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, which was nice, actually. So it was quite in kind of intense weekends where you'd come together and, spend the whole weekend talking about writing and having classes, and then you'd go away again. So it was very different.
What period was it over?
2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it seems that cohort has had a lot of success. Do you think, was there a thing of, you mentioned surrounding yourself by writers, was it a group experience as well as an individual experience?
I think so, yeah. I think it was a very good course, but I think the best thing that most of us got out of that was being surrounded by those people, being surrounded by people who only talked about writing for 2 years and only talked about reading, people as obsessed with it as you are, I think, was really, really important.
And what are you doing? So you're writing full-time at the moment.
Yeah.
How are you finding that financially and in terms of feeling that you have to do other work as well?
Yeah, so I babysit a bit, as I said. I teach a little bit. I'm finding it's strange being self-employed, isn't it? Because you're constantly watching the money go down in a slightly panicked way, and that's something to get used to. also writing full time is quite isolating, as no one's telling you to work. You just have to work yourself.
Do you write at home in Oxford?
Yeah, I write at home mostly, or around Oxford, yeah. But I really enjoy it, actually. I like it. I like having the time for the project to, compost and to really work on it, to really think about it.
And we should say on the money thing, it's something we ask everyone on the show because we feel that it's not discussed in this sort of world. But does that, fiction advances are not massive and so forth. Are you able to make it work, to support yourself? I mean, you say a bit of work around the side, but, are you self-supporting as a writer?
Just about.
Yeah.
I've been so lucky this last year. I got a really good teaching gig for a couple of months at York. Okay. I also won the Edge Hill Prize, which was £10,000, and that kind of took me from being completely panicked to being just about okay. Mm-hmm. And then, again, with all of the Man Booker stuff, it just means the book's selling better. My advances will hopefully be a bit bigger. I'm getting more foreign advances. But particularly advances here are not very big. So you are always sort of just eking it out for as long as possible. And I am now in the fortunate position that there is less eking, which is really nice.
Have you ever thought about a backup plan just in case, when, in a few years' time, you never know where these things go?
Yeah, teaching, I guess, is sort of my backup plan. And I thought a lot about doing a PhD to make that easier, but that's not right at the moment. I also guess I hope that Blackwell's would always take me back if something really awful happened. But I think definitely teaching for bits and bobs to try and get me through is sort of my backup plan.
And would that be teaching creative writing or teaching in a sort of more conventional literature studies
Yeah, teaching
way?
Creative writing, yeah.
Sure. Can you tell us a bit about, what your ways into publishing were, in terms of, where you were publishing your first stories, how you went through the mechanics of agent, editor? What were the kind of, the nursery slopes into fiction for you? How did it work?
So doing the undergrad really got me into writing short stories. That was kind of what we were writing. That's what we were working on. And I found it really hard just writing and not having anywhere to send them. So I decided that I was going to start sending off stuff to competitions and to magazines. And that's sort of what I was doing while I was at Oxford. And I got a few things, kind of a lot of local stuff. And then I got something in the Boston Review, which was kind of the first big thing that ever happened. And at the same time, I was working on a novel and sending that out to people. Nothing happened with that one. And then I was working on Fen, my short story collection, and sending that out, and I managed to get an agent. And I worked with that agent.
Were you just sending it out blind, or did the course at Oxford, was it able to kind of funnel you?
At that point, I was sending it out blind. And then, actually, so when I got the agent, it was that the course had an end-of-year reading, and they would send out a pamphlet to a lot of agencies. And the agent got in contact with me through that. And I worked with him on Fen, and then also we kind of decided that people don't publish short stories. So I needed to work on a novel as well. So then we kind of worked on a novel idea together. And then when I'd finished most of Fen, we sent that out to publishers. And I managed to get a 2-book deal with Jonathan Cape. And then I've since changed agents for various reasons. But yeah, that's kind of how I came about.
What is your view on the short story as form? I mean, as you say, it's economically not that viable, but it seems that both within the teaching of creative writing and people trying to publish it, that there is interest there. Perhaps this is changing, but aesthetically as well. What do you think about it?
Yeah, on a publishing level, I think it is changing. I think there's been some really massive short story collections over the last year or so. Talking about Cat People, was that what the short story was called?
The New Yorker one.
Yeah.
Cat Person.
Cat Person, yeah, sorry. Things like that, I think, are just slightly blowing it up a bit more. I also think, for me, it was how I learned how to write. It was how I learned how to be edited. And that's why I'll always write short stories. They're kind of where I've come from. But, we're talking about money. I knew quite early on that if I wanted to make it as a writer, I couldn't just write short stories. There just isn't, there are a couple of writers in the world who just write short stories, most of them American, I think. I think you do have to consider that when you go into it. But I do think also that short stories are a really good way to, writing a novel, you don't have any criticism for years and years while you're writing it. Whereas if you can write a short story, you can send it out to places, you can get feedback. So I do think it's a really good place, not just to start, but to, for all writers to do.
And what was the process like for writing your short stories versus how you wrote Everything Under, in terms of how long you wrote for? I know that you said previously that Everything Under took many drafts and you would change the setting and the characters, which must have been draining. How can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so Fen, I'm not sure how long Fen took, maybe a couple of years to write. And there were definitely hard bits of writing it. But perhaps because I've just finished Everything Under, Everything Under did feel a lot harder to write, I think. By the time I'd written Fen, I'd been writing short stories for quite a long time. I knew how to do them. I hadn't mastered it, but I kind of understood the form. I was reading a lot of short stories. And then when I came to writing a novel, I'd written novels before, but nothing up to the, that was finished. So I was teaching myself how to write a novel, which I think is why it took so many drafts.
How were you teaching yourself?
By mucking up, endlessly. So the way it worked was I would write a draft and then delete most of it, take maybe a paragraph, and then write another draft with that paragraph in. And eventually there were less and less things deleted, but it did take maybe 7 entire rewrites to get to the finished form. It wasn't a logical way to write it. I didn't plan when I was writing. I just sort of ploughed on. And I do wonder if the next novel I write won't be written that way. But potentially also Everything Under had to be written that way because it's fragmented. I was working out what point of view I wanted to use, what tenses I wanted to use, what characters I needed to talk. And I think when I write short stories, they come quite fast. They'll be in my head for a while and then they'll be written quite fast. And there won't be that sort of going back over and deleting endless drafts, which was quite painful, I think, for this kind of panic that I'd already got an advance for the novel. I had to write a novel, so I was panicking as I wrote it, and that's maybe why it was written the way it was.
Go ahead, Ellie.
I was just going to say, were you worried at any point, because Everything Under is, you trust the reader, you don't signpost everything, which I think it is good, and the narrative isn't linear. Did you worry that an impatient editor might make you simplify it a lot and take that quirkiness out of it?
I was working with the editor on it quite a lot from the beginning, because the draft I showed them right at the start when they bought it was entirely different from the draft that was then at the end. So a lot of it was my, having phone calls with my editor, them sending me long emails saying this is what I think we should do. So I knew that the editor's idea for what it was quite similar to mine. What I did worry about was readers not, finding it difficult. And I know some readers, some people come up to me at signings and say, well, I found it very confusing. And I did want them to be a sense of discombobulation, I think, as you're reading it. I did want you to feel like the characters feel slightly confused, but I didn't want it to be too confusing. And I think that is a line that it balances on and sometimes falls the wrong way.
Can you talk a bit about the process of editing in fiction? Because obviously editing is an enormous part of writing, but in something as subjective as fiction, what's your experience of that? What are your positive experiences of editing and perhaps some of the more challenging experiences you've had?
Yeah, so I was teaching a class in York this year, and one of the things I really tried to go over to them is that they have to edit. That I think writing. I know some people love editing, but writing for me is such a beautiful thing. You're kind of streaming onto the page, and I'd said to the students, 85% of writing is editing, and I found that really hard, especially with Everything Under. I think one of the hardest things I found was just how many words were being deleted. Whole threads, whole ideas, whole books were being deleted, and that was really, really challenging. I think one of the things that really worked for me was putting it away, between each draft for as long as I possibly could, putting it in a drawer, not thinking about it, and then trying to come back to it with fresh eyes and see it the way a first reader would see it.
How long would you put it away for?
As long as possible, as long as I possibly had, so months at a time, yeah. Because otherwise you're just so close to it, you can't see what's going on. I also enjoyed, I think one of the nice things about editing is that in some drafts it's just you, but eventually you'll send it out to someone. You'll send it to a friend, or you'll send it to your agent or your parents, and then there's the discussion about it. The discussion about what it means, what you're trying to say, and I enjoyed that with Everything Under.
How big is your circle of early readers? We had Hermione Leon, who said that she became a Philip Roth reader in the early 80s and was
nice.
like welcomed into this little
How
world.
terrifying.
But, yeah, it's scary. Well, he wasn't quite as famous then, but how many people is it going to in a relatively early form?
It's going to 3 friends who we kind of share bits and bobs back and forth. Kira Multhargrove is one of them. And then my agent also gets relatively early drafts, and then probably just after that, but not too far after that, is my editor.
And going back to the Booker Prize, you are the youngest ever author shortlisted. How did that feel? How much of an impact did that fact make upon you? I mean, that was what everyone was talking about in the press.
Yeah, that was very nice, and I think that's probably why the book has sold quite well. I yo-yoed around with it because I thought it was really nice for me that everyone was talking about that, but actually there were more exciting things on the shortlist than my being young. I felt, there was a book on the shortlist which was written entirely in verse. Even The Milkman I thought was more interesting than my being 27.
Have you read the whole shortlist?
Yes, I have, yeah, which I very much enjoyed. But obviously for me, it's my first novel. That's really exciting, yeah.
Did you feel that people treated you differently after you were nominated?
Yeah.
And I suppose,
but...
did you feel vindicated, or was it in time like a bit frightening? The way people behaved to you.
It's somewhere in between, I think. I think I felt vindicated in writing a book which is quite confusing, which is not necessarily traditionally structured. Now, going back to writing, it is terrifying because there is, I think, second book syndrome with my third book, because there is always going to be this pressure to write something as good as Everything Under, as good as the book that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I suppose people did treat me differently. I'm getting a lot more, interviews and things like that. A lot of friends are getting in contact who I haven't heard from a long time. Yeah.
Does any of it seem false?
Yeah, some of it, I suppose. I mean, it's hard to see outside of it, and I think that's maybe going to be one of the things to watch out for as I continue writing. Is, I have to be as good an editor as I was before, and even though people might be saying, it's good, if that makes sense. Yeah.
The reviews of Everything Under were very good, very positive, but I think there was one in particular that said that both Everything Under and Anna Burns's Milkman were both difficult to read, as you've said before, and that kind of brings us back to the whole Man Booker debate. Like, sometimes it's too unreadable, sometimes it's too lowbrow. What do you make of that whole debate around it?
Yeah, I've really felt for Anna Burns, actually, because I think she's written a really interesting book that's trying to challenge us as readers. I do also think that the last 3 books that have won the Booker Prize, all by men, have not been called difficult, despite the fact that George Saunders' book is, incredibly difficult book to read. And I think...
That's interesting. So you think there's an element of gender?
I think there is, yeah.
Difference.
I think, yeah. I don't know why.
Is it because you feel people don't want to invest themselves as much in a woman's writing? They don't make the effort as much, or they don't admire it?
Or there's an apology, perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm sorry this book is difficult. And I don't think anyone would ever apologise for George Saunders. What were we talking about? I can't remember what the beginning question was.
Oh, just that some of the reviews picked up on the fact that they found yours and Anna Burns's novels difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the books on the shortlist were relatively difficult, but it is a literary shortlist, a literary prize, and I think it should be challenging structure and the way we write, the way we think about writing. I think it would be strange if the books weren't difficult, whatever difficult might mean.
The other big debate, I suppose, with the Booker is opening it to international writers. Do you have thoughts on that?
I can't decide. I go back and forth. I think that we're probably missing out on a lot of writers from the Commonwealth who we would otherwise be seeing. I think for me, being on the shortlist, when it's opened up to American writers, is really good, because I think it means a lot of Americans are really, really excited about the list. You know, I think they were excited before; they might be even more excited now. I think it would have been more controversial if an American man had won this year. I don't know. Yeah.
Were you surprised and pleased that the long list was female dominated? Did that make an impression on you?
Yeah, I was pleased, particularly, you know, kind of young female dominated, young women writing about young women. I thought was really exciting.
Sally Rooney's quite young as well, isn't she?
Yeah, she's actually younger than me, I think.
Yeah, 27, I think. Yeah. And I think it was the chairman of the Man Booker said that the whole shortlist was a reflection of our dark times, because all of them treat quite serious issues. Would you say that was an accurate reflection of your book, that it depicted dark times?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily how I wrote it. But I'm pleased that it's being viewed that way. I think particularly some of the ideas about gender, which are in it, I think are quite relevant to, you know, the discussions that are happening at the moment.
Why did you choose to write about gender in that way?
Primarily because the myth I was looking at and all the myths that I was surrounding myself with are filled with gender change. You know, it's something that happens a lot in Greek myths. I was also really interested in writing about characters who I don't think we see very often in literature.
Can I ask, what is the actual Booker ceremony like? You know, what are the canapes like? What do people talk about in the loos? Like, does anyone get embarrassingly drunk? You know, because obviously, as you say, writing is a very solitary thing, and yet this is an awards ceremony. And I know that when this was first, it was televised in the 80s, and it kind of created a notion of what it was to be a novelist. But as you say, these are like quite introverted people who spend a lot of time on their own. So what's it like, you know, from that perspective?
Yeah, so I watched the. Did you watch the Booker documentary?
No.
It was a documentary about kind of the archives of the Booker, which was basically Booker authors and judges and people in publishing getting very drunk and behaving very badly, you know, sort of punching each other, and it was very civilized actually. But I think you're right. It's a bit strange taking all these very introverted people who. You know, we spend 4 years coming up with one sentence, and then suddenly you stick us in a room with Camilla and, you know, expect us to talk to people. But I really enjoyed it. The canapes were very tasty. It's hard to enjoy when you're just waiting, you know, so you get there at, I think I got there at 5:30, and then the announcement isn't until 20 to 10. So you just kind of spend the whole time trying not to drink too much. And
yeah, how fraught is everyone getting? And is it clear, has everyone read each other's work? Is there a sense of competition?
You've spent the whole weekend doing events with each other, which was actually really nice. So you get a chance to meet each other, you know, have a drink together. So there wasn't a sense of competition. There was kind of a sense of camaraderie, I think. And we were all on separate tables, but there didn't feel any kind of aggression towards anybody. Yeah.
And everyone had read each other's books.
I don't think everybody had time to. Yeah.
What's your feeling more generally about? I suppose, you know, envy and things like that. You know, did you get people when you were nominated who were not gracious towards you, or who exhibited, you know, maybe made comments about your age or anything like that? How graceful were people in the experience of it?
To my face, people were really graceful, actually. Yeah. And I can't imagine how it would feel if people weren't. And I'm sure it happens, but yeah, no, to my face, everyone was very nice.
And you know, what do you think I suppose I'm trying to get, you know, that envy is famously the writer's sin, right? You know, how do you? I mean, the way I suppose I think the wisest way to think about it is that there's two forms of envy. There's kind of constructive envy, which is saying like so and so has done a really impressive thing, I'd like to emulate that, and there's negative envy, which is saying, you know, so and so has done a great thing, I'd like them to die, and I think there is a choice between, you know, you do have a choice with these things.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in someone who's had this, you know, huge kind of plaudit. Whether you have any thoughts on that, on the, you know, how one should behave towards other writers and how people do behave towards people in those situations.
Yeah, I think just trying to always push towards that first one.
Don't touch the table.
I mean, it's difficult even, you know, sometimes you'll be sat at your desk and you're reading another writer and you think, oh, God. But you're also just, you know, as a writer, everything is fodder, everything is something that's seeping into you, and then passing out the other side as writing. So I think you just always have to think of it as that. You just always have to think of it as work, and how can I be better? How can I think about what has happened to this person? What have they have written? And take it into my own writing. I've had a really nice experience with the writers I've met. I've never... but yeah, of course it's hard. You're all, the writing world, particularly in this country, is quite small. Everyone's, applying for the same prizes. You're in the same publishing house as everyone who's applying for the same prizes. You just have to be constructive about it, I think.
What do you find particularly stimulating when you're writing, in terms of, do you ever take yourselves to certain places? Do you travel? Do you read particular writers, watch certain films? What do you use to kind of stimulate your mind when you're feeling in a kind of hole, or have got writer's block? Or
Yeah, so there are a couple of books I have on my desk which kind of cycle in and out, but which I have there just so that if I'm really struggling I can open them and read them. And so Evie Wilde is one of them, Sarah Hall. I've recently been going back to Angela Carter for an essay. I'm really enjoying her. Short stories, I have a lot of short stories always around, so you can just, flick them open and read them. I'm also, the next book is a horror novel, so I've spent a lot of time watching a lot of really bad horror films, which I've been enjoying.
Of course, you've mentioned how you're obsessed with haunted houses. And...
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a Halloween baby, so I've always been obsessed with horror and things like that. Yeah, travelling, I think, is also really good. I sometimes get a bit stuck in my house, but actually every time I go anywhere else, it always ends up being in a book.
Really?
Yeah. So going to York, we went to Yorkshire this year. We have a camper van. We lived in Yorkshire for 3 months while I was teaching up there. And then that's become, is now the idea for the latest book. Yeah.
Can I ask about the role of Oxford, or writing stuff that's set in Oxford? I mean, I read something somewhere that Oxford is the most written about city in the English language. It has such a tradition, everything from Philip Pullman to Jan Morris and Evelyn Waugh and so forth. What's it like using that as your landscape?
It's not something I even thought about, but I think because the Oxford I was writing about and everything under is not that Oxford. Mm-hmm. In some of the earlier drafts of the novel I tried to write
not
about... Not
which Oxford? Philip Pullman's or
not
Evelyn
the Philip Pullman or the Evelyn Waugh.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, they're different, aren't they? But is not the city Oxford.
Okay.
Is not the tourist Oxford or the student Oxford. It's kind of the outskirts, the river, the canals, the wild Oxford. And I tried to write about the city Oxford in an earlier draft and it just didn't work. I hope one day I'll be able to write about cities, but it's not working at the moment. I love living in Oxford surrounded by all of that, going to the pub that C.S. Lewis wrote in and going past the place Philip Pullman set the book on the bus. It is kind of seeped in language and in history, but it's not something I'm ready to write about yet.
So can you tell us more about your new book, your horror book?
Yes, so it's early drafts, but it's about two sisters living in a house in Yorkshire and strange things start happening when they're there.
And why do you love horror so much as a genre?
I think because I grew up with it from a very young age. My parents, I think, were like, okay, she's a horror baby, a Halloween baby. Well, all of the parties will be Halloween themed. So my dad would make these kind of strange feasts where he'd label everything, witches' fingers and eyeballs. And then they gave me my first Stephen King when I was quite young. And I think that's probably the seed of the interest is Stephen King and what he's writing about. I also think writers can learn a lot from horror. I think the way horror does tension and suspense is quite masterful.
What do you think more broadly about genre writing? I mean, we interviewed Ian Rankin a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about how he wrote his first book and didn't think it was a crime novel, and then he was put in that genre and he was kind of uncomfortable with it, and then emerged from it. Are you're almost going the other way, and you've written very sort of self-defined literary fiction, and you're going to a genre. What are they even helpful signposts?
As a bookseller, they're helpful.
Yeah.
I suppose, as a publisher to sell them. I think the snobbery and elitism around them is not helpful at all. And I think maybe something which is quite exciting, which is happening, is that the grey area is becoming a bit bigger. They're slightly merging the different, the different genres and literary genre and I am writing literary fiction because of the way it's written and the audience that it's aimed at, but I'm also, using a lot of tropes from horror, using a lot of tropes from sci-fi and fantasy and the weird, magical realism. And I think more and more writers are, which I think is really exciting.
What kind of horror is it? Is it psychological? Will it be gruesome as well?
I don't think it'll be gruesome, but we'll see.
Do you watch horror films?
Yeah, I watch a lot of horror films, yeah.
What are some of your favourites?
There's actually been some really good ones the last few years, which are kind of feminist horror films. So It Follows and The Babadook. I like that one. Yeah, and Girl Walks Home Alone are very inspiring to me.
And what's your kind of contractual position now in terms of how many books are you contracted to do? Has that changed with the prize and so forth?
I'm contracted to do the horror novel, and that's it at the moment.
Okay. And do you feel that now, you have kind of more flexibility in being able to do the kind of projects you'd want to do, more leverage basically in the market?
We'll see. It hasn't. I sold the horror novel before all the book of stuff, so it hasn't really come up yet.
And it's with Cape again.
It's with Cape again. Yeah.
Does it have a name?
No, not yet.
And what about in terms of how it will be presented? And again, this has come up with this idea of genre, of how the covers are done and things like that. Do you have thoughts on that, on how you'd like it to look and that sort of thing?
Not yet. I think because of the way I write, I'm always going to be marketed as literary. And I trust the publisher. That's why I've stayed with them. I trust them to make the right decision and to market in the right way and to reach the right audience.
Would you ever consider journalism, or is that too at odds with because your books are kind of full of your imagination and you obviously love words, which sometimes is at odds with kind of very straight reporting, newspaper journalism?
I've written some essays, which I hadn't done until this year, which I've really enjoyed. It's nice to do something so entirely different from fiction writing.
You talked about on the Oxford course as well how you were forced into the different genres. Do you see any interest in playwriting or poetry or screenwriting now as well?
I am talking to a producer at the moment about maybe writing something for the screen. And
what's that like?
Really fun, yeah. It's so entirely different from writing because it's right from the beginning. It's collaborative, so it's all just meetings and just chatting and just throwing ideas back and forth. And I'm really enjoying that. I don't know if anything will come of it, but it's exciting. I used to write a lot of poetry and then haven't, and I hope one day I will go back to it.
What was your poetry about? What kind of poetry?
Some of it was retellings, like Everything Under. It was bad poetry, I think, probably.
And will Everything Under be? You're talking about translations before. Where will it be?
Okay, so let me remember. So far, it is going to come out in France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Greece, and China.
It'll be difficult to translate, I think, because.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what they do with the made-up words. Yeah.
Oh, yes, Bonac.
Yeah.
Another point that's come up with writers, particularly those who've had a fairly high level of success, is that they're surprised by how much of the business of writing is not writing. So it's going and doing publicity or marketing or things like that. How have you found kind of entry into that world, doing readings, interaction with readers? I don't know whether you talk in schools or other things, but that part of it.
Frightening. But I think some writers hate it a lot more than I do, and I actually quite enjoy it. I really like reading. I like doing things like this, podcasts. I think, again, we've talked about writers being isolated. I think anything you can do to not be isolated, to try and see, to try and get out into the world is really, really important. I enjoy it. But I think you're right. I think you don't necessarily go into writing thinking that's what it's going to be like. And actually, I always thought when I was a writer that I could live anywhere in the world. And actually, I'm in London twice a week, for things like this.
What's your experience of, the book signing and interacting in person with readers? What's that like?
Mostly really, really good. Some of the shortlist stuff was a bit weird because there were so many book dealers, which I'd never really encountered before. So
I'm not sure I know what a book dealer is.
I think someone who buys a lot of first editions. When they've come out, gets them all signed and then will sell them on their website for, I don't know how much, but thousands, I think.
I bet they're quite unique people.
Yeah, they are. And, none of them had read the book, which was a bit weird. Because I think the really nice thing about doing book signings is when someone comes up and says, this meant a lot to me. I liked it because of this personal thing in it. But mostly they're really lovely. Mostly I really, really enjoy them.
On your Goodreads page, it seems like a lot of people have listened to the book. How does that feel? Have you heard your book read?
I've heard a bit of it, and then didn't. I think, I mean, it sounds amazing, but I didn't want to listen to it again.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, but
Would you
I
rather
really
people read it, though, rather than listen to it? Are you purist about?
No, I think anyway, I don't think that reading is the easiest way for a lot of people. And also everyone has such busy lives, it's so nice to listen to an audiobook when you're on the train or... So no, I don't have a preference.
What's your thought about Goodreads? I think Kieran left flamboyantly this week, saying it was a trap and a terrible thing for writers. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't read my reviews on there,
Okay.
which I think was what Kieran was saying. Kieran's very diligent at reading her reviews, and I just don't do that on Goodreads because I just...
Do you do on Amazon?
No, I don't.
Where do you read them?
I read them in newspapers and on websites, but I kind of just drew a line, I think, and I think because you could just spend your whole life... A boundary, yeah. You could just spend your whole life reading reviews on Amazon, and I think it would drive you mad. But I use Goodreads I have a very bad memory, so I use it to just say how many books I've read a year, and, so then I can look back and say, oh yeah, I read that, and which I like it for that.
Do you read all your newspaper reviews, or there's some newspapers that you won't read?
Yeah, I read all of the ones that I know about, yeah. Yeah.
And what's that experience like? What was it like the first time you read a review of your work?
Oh. I guess it depends. It depends whether it was good or bad. I think what will always happen inevitably is that you find the one paragraph which is bad. Or you find the one, and there have been some really bad reviews. People who it's just not their kind of book, and that's fine.
Have they misunderstood it in any way?
Oh, I don't want to say that, but I think it's just not for them, And it's not a perfect book, of course. No book is a perfect book, and that's kind of why I read them, because I think to try and learn from them, to try and think, what can I do better next time? What can I do different next time? And also to try and stay connected, to try and keep the idea that you're writing for readers, not for yourself.
Can I ask, what are your sales like?
So as far as I know, I think this is probably going to be an old number, but they're at about 6,500, maybe 7,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
In hardback.
In hardback, yeah.
And what is, again, this is I think, so people don't know about it. What is the expectation with a literary novel of what would represent good sales for that? Do your publishers talk about this?
No, they don't. I think I'm doing relatively well.
Yeah.
Fen sold about 2,000, which is relatively good for a short story collection. I think they're hoping to do better with the paperback. But it's always going to be quite low. I think Anna Burns, since the Booker, has sold about 10,000, which is for a literary novel just like incredible. Yeah.
Do you feel pressure to kind of cultivate a brand on social media, and because that's what everyone's doing at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. It's something I talk to my publicist a lot about. Just because that's just a new way that people connect with writers, and I hated it to begin with, and now I don't mind it, so it's fine.
Do you have like a number of tweets that you feel like you need to do a week, or?
No, I just try and, I don't know. I guess a couple a week. I just try and do it when I can. But
and again, where are your boundaries on social media? I mean, what again? I talked to we talked to Ian Rankin about this, but also we had Mark Haddon on, who said, like, I'll talk to anyone. Seems like
it's because he's such a nice person.
Yeah, so he was lovely, but it seemed a bold and perhaps unwise strategy. I mean, who do you talk to? Who do you not talk to? Where do you draw the line? How public are you?
I answer everyone's messages that they send me on Twitter. I've recently, since all the Booker stuff, found quite a lot of people trying to be my friend on Facebook, which I slightly draw the line at, draw the boundary at. It hasn't. I've never really had a negative experience from it yet, and maybe that will jade me more. But yeah, I agree with him. I think as long as Mark Haddon's probably getting a lot more messages than I am, but as long as nothing horrible is happening, I don't see why you shouldn't, just talk to anyone.
And how much of yourself do you share in your writing, if at all?
Unintentionally, probably quite a lot.
So the kind of mother-daughter relationship, is that based on your own family?
No, my mum's really lovely. And a lot of everything under is, because it's a retelling, a lot of it is not about me. But I think, all the things about language has come from me. And yeah, I think sometimes when I read it back, I'll see things that I didn't realise were from me, but that have kind of seeped in
What kind of
accidentally.
things from everything under have you noticed?
Yeah, so on the language, I'm dyslexic, and I never really knew why I was so interested in this made up language, and I think that's why, because I'm always, I say words wrong, or I forget words, or I spell words wrong, and I think that's definitely where that's come from.
So was bonac a word that you were accidentally saying?
Bonac came from, I just wanted something that sounded really sharp, sounded sort of snapping, the kind of word that a child would come up with to describe something frightening.
It's like the Babadook kind of
Yeah,
word.
it is. Yeah. You're not supposed to say that, but yeah, that was definitely like an inspiration for that word.
Where has your dyslexia fitted with your writing? I mean, with A.A. Gill, it seemed that it was a big part of his process and taken through dictation and his manner of how has that fitted with how you work?
That's an interesting question. I suppose it probably comes a lot into all my drafting. That's probably why I do so many drafts, because it takes a bit longer. I'm not an awful speller, people are a lot more dyslexic than I am, but I think definitely in the themes, the things I want to write about, I think that's why language and, kind of, so in Fen, there's a lot about the aggressiveness of language, language having its own character, sort of even a kind of colonial character, and I think that's definitely where it's come from. I do also think that just having spell check is a bit of a saviour.
And we covered this a bit in discussion of your editing and stuff like that, but another big division that's come up with novelists we've had is to the extent that they plan and to the extent they kind of throw themselves in, whether you have a schematic of how the whole book is or you just follow your nose. What's your approach with that? It's
different for everything, but with the novel I'm working on at the moment, I will plan an entire draft, so little chapter boxes, so I know what's supposed to happen in each chapter. But I think I'm quite impatient. I always get too excited, so I will just go off plan, and the plan will kind of dissolve, or I'll lose it, or I think I would like to be a planning novelist, but I'm not really, maybe.
Okay.
You said how you didn't really plan at all for everything under, so these chapter boxes, is that a new strategy that you're doing that you didn't do before?
Yeah, I tried to do it in some of the drafts for Everything Under, and then that's just not how it worked. But and the novel that I wrote before Everything Under, which never really came of anything, that I used chapter boxes for that as well.
Do you try and write for a certain number of hours a day?
I try, and when I'm writing, I try and write for a certain word count a day.
Which is what?
Which would be kind of anything between 2,000 and 4,000.
Well, that's a lot.
I write fast, and then it's rubbish.
Do you ever handwrite, or is it always on your computer?
I handwrite notes, but the actual writing is on my computer.
So if it's 4,000 words a day, so you sort of have a novel draft in a month or something like that.
2,000 to 4,000 words a day. But
okay.
So not every day, it will be 4,000. Okay. But yeah, that's kind of how I write. Is I write drafts very fast, and then go back and delete a lot of it and write it again, and keep doing that.
Okay.
Gosh, yes. And how many do you think you'll have a limit to how many drafts you want this new horror book, considering you had 7 or 8 for Everything Under, which must have been exhausting by the end?
So this is the 3rd draft of this one, but not 3rd from scratch.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm hoping there's going to be less. But it's now kind of I'm working on my editor's edits, my editor and my agent's edits for this. So I think it's more down. It's kind of down to her as well at this point. But I don't think there'll be 7.
Can you alluded to changing agents earlier. Can you give any context of why, I mean, say as much or as little as you like about this, but why you made the decision to change who was representing you?
My agent went to work in publishing.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
And I was offered the opportunity to stay at the agency where he worked with his boss, but I didn't want to, and so I found a new agent.
Because something that, again, we discussed often is if you're a young writer, what are the relative advantages of having your people, so your agent, your editor, like very, very experienced but perhaps time poor, as opposed to like youngsters who don't have as much experience, but they're perhaps more invested in you. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so certainly in looking for an agent the second time around, I was in a really good position in that people wanted to be with me as well as I wanted to be with them, because I already had a book written that was doing okay. And I met, as you say, a lot of agents who were older, who had a lot bigger lists, and who did have less time. And I eventually decided that I kind of wanted to go with someone younger who was going to grow at the same time as I was growing. You know, we were going to hopefully make our careers together. And my editor is similar. She's not the same editor that I worked on Fen with, but I worked on Everything Under with her, and she is now, there's only 2 authors on her list. And I really like that. I really like kind of, you know, becoming.
You posted a really interesting question that an interviewer asked you about horror on your Twitter the other day, and I've been thinking about it as well, which was, how does horror manifest itself at sentence level? Were you able to answer when the interviewer asked you, and do you have an answer now?
Yeah, I blathered for ages and was really excited about it. I think what I meant and what I've thought about is, you know, when we're writing horror fiction, does the way the sentences are structured, you know, their length or the use of punctuation, is it any different from when we're writing literary fiction? And obviously there are parts of Everything Under which are horror-like. And I think it's maybe something to do with, you know, drawing the reader along. Horror is all about how long can we hold the reader before the big reveal, you know, before the scare. So I think, using punctuation to do that. I'm actually now working on my horror novel. I'm changing it into first person, which is something I'm interested about.
Do you think that makes it scarier?
I think it makes it's something I needed for this particular book because I need to be that close to the character. And I think that will make it scary.
I guess psychologically.
Connection. And the way that the character will use their sentences, how scary that is.
Well, that seems a very good place to bring this to a close. Daisy, thanks for being so gracious and talking so candidly about a broad range of things, and wishing you the very best with all your projects going forward.
And congratulations again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So Simon, how did you think that interview with Daisy Johnson went?
So this is us introducing a bit of a new feature on the podcast. We're going to have a kind of brief post-mortem of how it went after the episode. I thought it was really interesting. I thought that, I'm always fascinated with people who've been through these big experiences, whether it's having a massive bestseller or winning a prize, you know, what that moment is like, what the emotional tenor of it is like. Clearly she'd done a lot of press and a lot of interviews, but I thought we more or less dug
she was
into
slightly
that.
wary, but to be expected after
I think
a flurry of press.
Very
Very humble, I thought. I don't think she was used to talking about herself.
Well, we were also in the Penguin Random House podcast bunker, which is always a slightly odd experience to do it. But I think, you know, that in some ways is why it's interesting to do this, to talk to someone, you know, and just get a sense of what it felt like to be there.
Exactly.
Anyway, an update from our lives. What have you been doing?
So I am wrapping up my last day at GQ today.
Literally right now.
Literally, we're in the office and I have about 4 hours left until Dylan Jones reveals the mocked up cover that he's done with me, which we do for everyone that leaves, with some awful cover lines, I'm sure.
And we should say that you can probably hear the Condé Nast lunchtime rush in the background. And then you've got a month off.
I've got 3.5 weeks off, I'm going to New York to visit my boyfriend who lives out there, and then I'm going to Paris for a few days by myself, and then going to Mexico for a week.
Fantastic. I have just submitted another round of my book to the copy editor. I hesitate to say that it's the last thing, but I think it almost is. It's going off to production, which is very exciting. And then I am off to Spain to go and do a trek as my post-book treat.
Is that a story or just...
No, I wanted to do something so cliched that I couldn't possibly write it. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam.
And me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Zara Hankier handles our social media. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser. You now say...
Oh yes, sorry, I was just staring into your eyes there. Yes, you can follow us on Twitter at Take Notes Always, or on Instagram and Facebook at Always Take Notes. You can also find us on iTunes, and please do leave a review if you enjoyed the episode.
And if you feel like contributing to our crowdfunding campaign, you can do so at patreon.com/alwaystakeNotes. Thank you.
Thank you.